So I'm going to talk about, as Sagrika said, about capitalism's fascistic tendencies. And I'm going to start with this idea that Adam Smith, as everyone knows, famously credits an invisible hand with running capitalist society. But what he doesn't say is that the problem with this authority is that no one can see it. That is, in capitalist society, it's difficult, I think, to recognize who's running the show. State authorities are evidently visible, but they don't run the capitalist economy, which is why most people, even those who aren't Marxist radicals, suspect there's someone else really in charge. And this tendency toward, so there's a tendency toward paranoia that I think is built into the structure of capitalist society to the capitalist system. So we become sure that someone behind the scenes secretly controls capitalist society precisely because the system objectively functions without a clear authority. So there's oppression, but there's no one clearly responsible for that oppression. There's no undisputed oppressor. So capitalism, I think, for this reason, produces paranoia, and it thrives on this paranoia because paranoia undermines the political approach required to counter capitalism's dominance. So paranoia is not just misguided. I think it actually represents a path through which capitalism forestalls the possibility of recognizing how we enjoy, taking responsibility for enjoyment, and engaging in creating some kind of other socioeconomic structure. So the paranoid subject, the point of it is, I think the paranoid subject cannot recognize itself as the source of its own enjoyment. And that's the way it gets led astray. So paranoia undermines the recognition of the structure of enjoyment by postulating a substantial authority that always operates behind the scenes to eliminate the contradictions within capitalist society and thus the sites that would trigger enjoyment. So although it responds to the absence of a visible social authority in capitalist society, paranoia actually posits a hidden authority who's really in charge of what appear to be the contingent fluctuations of the capitalist system. So for the psyche of the paranoiac, this figure exists whether it has an actual existence in the social reality or not. So the authority operative for the paranoiac is a substantial authority, an authority that's not lacking at all, and thus is unlike any visible authority. So the paranoiac's authority is always going to be stronger and more substantial than any authority that's visible, because visible authorities always have failings that are evident no matter how effective they function. So in contrast, the paranoiac's authority has none. It just operates without any faults. So the fact that the paranoiac authority operates undercover enables it to avoid suffering from lack, because we can't see it functioning in the open. We can't see the way that it comes up short. So it remains necessarily nebulous so that no one can poke holes in it. It's impossible to do so. So paranoia can't accept that the public authority, any public authority, is the real source of authority. And in capitalist society, this suspicion is not only reasonable, but it actually has the virtue of being correct. So the basic problem, however, with the paranoid response to capitalist society is that there's no head of capitalist society, but there's still an economic structure that is calling the shots. And so the point is that this is what's not recognized by paranoid subjectivity, which is what capitalist society itself produces. So the problem is that there's no head of state that runs capitalist society, even though there are obviously heads of states that run individual nations. So instead, what we have is the structure of capitalism that pulls the strings. So the nominal heads of state are really just responding to the exigencies of the capitalist that the capitalist drive has put into place. So the problem with capitalism is that we can't even identify economic actors as the real authorities. So someone like Bill Gates could run Microsoft, but he remains just as enthralled to the structural logic of capitalism as Emmanuel Macron or Joe Biden. So within capitalist society, the question ceases to be who's in charge and becomes what's in charge. I think this shift is really important, and I think the paranoia is, in a sense, a failure to recognize this shift, and it's paranoia that ultimately leads to fascism. So an abstruse and depersonalized authority is fundamentally dissatisfying. That's why I think there's this psychic resistance to recognizing the actual structure of authority in capitalist society. So this kind of authority doesn't give us any way to get our bearings relative to it. So it becomes impossible to do what Frederick Jameson calls cognitive mapping, which is this act of orienting oneself in the political space of the social order, of recognizing where the sources of oppression and emancipation lie. That's cognitive mapping for Jameson. And I think the structure of capital society militates against that process. So the paranoid subject can't grasp the working of a structural authority and thus seeks to personify it. The need that paranoia has for a personal villain bespeaks this fundamental failure to correctly apprehend the situation that capitalism produces. So the paranoiac, there's a little joke, I think, that nicely explains the problem with paranoia. So a paranoiac calls the paranoia help hotline, and a woman answers and says, "How'd you get this number?" So the point is that there's no outside to paranoia, right? Like you're still, even when you call the helpline, you're still stuck. Like the paranoia calls the helpline thinking, I'm going to get outside of the system and find someone that can help me, but there's no outside. So interestingly, I think paranoia is not an invention of modernity. I think we can see non-modern examples of it, but capitalist modernity, I think, unleashes paranoia in a way no earlier epoch could, precisely because of the form that capitalist society necessarily assumes. So it usurps the authority of any kind of national state power, and yet sets up the state leader to act as the semblance of authority. So in most traditional societies, in contrast, there's little ambiguity about the figure of authority. It's clear, it's a monarch or whoever occupies the seat of power. While one could develop a nice conspiracy theory that credits Benedictine monks with secretly controlling medieval Europe, there are those, the structure of society itself didn't facilitate the development of such a theory in the way that capitalist modernity did or does, which is why those kind of conspiracy theories, while they existed, were not as prevalent as they are today, even about medieval society. So the belief that public authority is lacking, that it is not fully authoritative, is not pathological. It's not paranoid. Every authority is a lacking authority, even prior to capitalist modernity. But so this move to question the authority of the public authority is, I think, the beginning of politics, a beginning that requires the follow-up of questioning the capitalist economy. But interestingly, paranoia takes a different step. So after questioning the authority of the public authority, it assumes that there's a hidden substantial authority figure behind the public authority who's actually pulling the strings. So rather than accepting the lack in all authority as constitutive of authority, of subjectivity, and as an indication that one must engage in political struggle, instead, what does the paranoid subject do? The subject rejects the idea of a lacking authority, and thereby, I think, rejects politics as such. So this kind of subject posits a non-lacking authority operating behind the actual scene of power, and this substantial authority behind the scenes is the real source of power. So any act on the part of the subject occurs against the background of this hidden authority that controls it. So for the paranoiac, the subject is not free to do anything at all. The hidden authority pulls all the strings in a determinate fashion, and this is the basic belief of paranoia and the reason for its fundamentally reactionary bearing, even if it imagines a secret cabal of capitalists running the show. So the paranoiac interprets the symbolic castration of public authority, so the visible and obvious lack, as evidence of another authority that's not subjected to castration. So the paranoiac correctly apprehends the lack in public authority, the possibility that no one escapes castration, that everyone is lacking, that no one is substantially whole, is, however, anathema to the paranoiac. The bridge from authority's castration to the universality of castration, symbolic castration, is a bridge too far. So rather than accepting the lack in public authority also pertains to any authority hidden behind that public figure, the paranoid subject identifies the non-lacking authority behind this public authority that's really calling the shots and that doesn't suffer from any symbolic castration. So paranoid subjectivity doesn't grasp the existence of a ruling structure, that is capitalist economy, built on the exploitation of symbolic castration. I think this is crucially what it misses, and this leads to the development of fascism. So capitalist economy takes advantage of a universal lack by holding out the promise of overcoming lack through, obviously, the fetishism. I say obviously, okay, to me it's obvious, fetishism of the commodity. So no one operates outside of the capitalist universe and manipulates it. Instead, it operates through everyone's collective activity, through everyone's tireless efforts to achieve a pure excess beyond any utility. So authority under capitalism is necessarily diffuse and impossible to pin down. That's why capitalism functions in the way it does and has the staying power that it has. But this idea of a diffuse and widespread authority is absolutely unacceptable to paranoid subjectivity. So I think this kind of subjectivity takes a double attitude toward authority. So it doubts official authorities, but it's certain about the hidden one. And this is always, it's very strange, right? So on the one hand, there's this total skepticism about public explanations. But on the other hand, there's an absolute credulity in the face of the explanations given by the person who's explaining the situation to the paranoiac. So the paranoiac sees what few others can, doubts what others trust, but ultimately trusts where others doubt, right? So the certainty of the paranoiac about the secret authority gives paranoia its libidinal appeal. So it's incredulous about the charade that takes everyone else in, but then it trusts the hidden authority that everyone else would be totally skeptical about. So in looking awry, I think Slavoj Žižek provides what to me is a definitive statement about the structure of paranoia. This is what he says. He says, when the paranoid subject clings to its distrust of the other of the symbolic community of common opinion, it thereby implies the existence of an other of another, of a non-deceived agent who holds the reins. The paranoiac's mistake does not consist in radical disbelief, in the conviction that there is a universal deception. Here the paranoiac is quite right. The symbolic order is ultimately the order of a fundamental deception, but rather in its belief that in a hidden agent who manipulates this deception. So that's the end of what Slavoj says. So the belief in a hidden authority that is not itself deceived represents the political misstep of paranoia. And this is not just a psychic disorder, but it's a political misstep that is incredibly widespread, I think, in capitalist society for the reasons I mentioned. And it leads the paranoid subject directly into the arms of the fascist leader. So capitalist society's proclivity for producing paranoia works hand in hand with its proclivity for producing fascism. So I don't think it's a coincidence that capitalist modernity must constantly wrestle with these offshoots of fascist subjectivity and the development of fascist states. So this is because this hidden authority is so dangerous and the secret plot is so nefarious that extreme measures are requisite in the mind of the paranoid subject, and these extreme measures are the turn to fascism. So the extreme measures take the form of the fascist leader and any kind of figure that will respond to this hidden force controlling things with extreme prejudice. So only the fascist leader, the paranoiac believes, has the power to challenge the hidden authority who's really running the show in capital society. So the fascist leader could say, the hidden authority running the show is a series of experts. It's Marxist. It's the people who are teaching critical race theory. It's woke society. Whatever this hidden authority is, that's what the fascist leader has in the mind of the paranoiac. The fascist leader has the capacity to confront and defeat. So the hidden authority could also be, and historically has been the Jew, the communist, the subversive. But again, whatever the case is, the fascist authority always has the correct answer in the paranoiac mind. So the fascist leader rounds up these hidden authority figures into camps or ostracizes them from the social order in order to combat their unparalleled and unearned influence in secretly guiding capitalist society. So by submitting to this fascist leader, paranoia finds the prospect of relief from the deviousness of the hidden authority. So the fascist leader never eliminates the hidden authority that the paranoiac fears. I think this is a crucial point about the way fascism functions. So on the one hand, it claims we have to get rid of this secret authority, the cabal that's really running the show. But on the other hand, it never wants to totally get rid of it. So no matter how decisive the leader's victories against the hidden authority are, the hidden authority remains a threat because the leaders require the threat in order to justify their rule. This is why at no point during the Nazi genocide does Adolf Hitler announce victory over the Jewish conspiracy, nor did Donald Trump say, oh, I've now triumphed over political correctness, nor does Viktor Orban announce he's finally done away with the threat posed by immigrants. The fascist leader rises as a force to combat capitalist society's hidden authority, supposed hidden authority. But if this battle ever ended, the leader would lose any raison d'etre, any reason for their position of power. So defeating the hidden authority would dissolve the paranoia that continually nourishes fascist rule. And I think this is important, that without an underlying paranoia, there's no fascism, that the two are to me, intricately linked. So the battle against hidden authority has to be perpetual. For the fascist leader to win, winning would actually be losing. So the problem with paranoia is not, I don't think, the obedience that it produces. Paranoiacs, as we can see today everywhere, aren't docile. After identifying the hidden, non-lacking authority, paranoid subjects don't say, oh, too bad, there's some secret force running society, I can't do anything about it. That's it. Instead, what do? They embark on a violent revolt against those who they identify as figures of hidden authority. These secret cabal, the forces of political correctness, communists, whatever. This is why they are, sooner or later, a violent threat to the social order. So for the paranoiac, authority is never where it appears to be. It's never present among those who wear the trappings of authority. Instead, it's lurking with those on the margins of society, primarily in those who don't belong to the social order and their defenders. So suspicion about illegitimate authority focuses on those who hide it under what they lack. So the illegitimate authority that the paranoid subject targets is always a figure replete with enjoyment. So the substantial authority figure enjoys in the subject's stead and serves to explain why the subject isn't enjoying itself. So that's the psychic function of this hidden authority that the paranoiac is targeting, that they offer an explanation for why the paranoid subject itself isn't enjoying in the way that it believes that it should. So the hidden authority becomes the reason for the subject's lack, which is structural rather than empirical. And the problem is that the paranoiac interprets it as empirical rather than structural. The problem is that capitalism doesn't permit the subject to avow the inevitability of symbolic castration and at the same time remain a capitalist subject. So what it means to be a capitalist subject is to not avow the inevitability of symbolic castration. So an investment in the possibility of overcoming castration and achieving plenitude is actually written in to the capitalist structure. For most, awareness of castration is impossible to avoid when the suffering of perpetual lack in the capitalist economy ensures it. However, capitalism directs the subject to look for satisfaction where it cannot possibly find it, thereby creating subjects unable to embrace their own form of satisfaction and looking for someone to blame for the failure. So I'm constantly confronted with my own failure and with my own lack, but I look out and I see, oh, it seems like there's someone non-lacking out there, and it seems like someone else is preventing me from getting to that position. And this is what the turn to paranoia and ultimately the turn to fascism provides. So paranoiacs know why they don't receive the enjoyment that capitalist society promises them. That's the great benefit of paranoia. They gain this knowledge, however, at the price of an ability to recognize themselves as inherently lacking subjects, so to recognize themselves as they actually are. And I think the great discovery of psychoanalysis is that the subject satisfies itself not through obtaining an object, but through the process of not having it. So if obtaining an object could provide satisfaction, I think Freud would not have existed. A subject enjoys an absent object, not a present one. And yet, capitalism as a structure depends on a subjective investment in a satisfaction of having the object. without that idea, without the idea that I can have the object and get some greater satisfaction in that way than the satisfaction of absence, there's no capitalism. So capitalism as a structure requires that. But it gives the subject, in this way, an impossible quest. And paranoia provides a bad guy for capitalism to put the blame on for the impossible project that it gives the subject. So as a subject, I don't get what capitalist society promises. Why don't I get it? Paranoia provides the answer. Because the subject emerges through its self-division without any prior wholeness, it can never search for a lost completion in the object that it pursues. So there's no lost wholeness that one might restore. As a result, acquiring is inherently disappointing. So I get something, it's never what I thought it would be. This is because the subject has never lost something that it might recover. Instead, the subject has to enjoy its lack, since lack is what constitutes it as a subject. So I come into being through my lack, and that's the form that my enjoyment has to take. Although capitalism doesn't allow us to avow this form of enjoyment. And I think that's its great deception, and that's the thing that leads down the path of paranoia and fascism. So capitalism as an socioeconomic structure sends subjects on a quixotic search for a non-lacking plenitude embodied in the commodity. So every socioeconomic system operates through some distribution of enjoyment. Each system differs in the particular way that it enacts this distribution. But the actual distribution alone, I don't think, defines the system. Instead, what matters as much, or maybe even more, than the actual distribution of enjoyment is the way that the fantasy structure of the system is oriented. What defines a socioeconomic system, I want to say, is the phantasmatic distribution of enjoyment that underlies it. Most traditional societies rely on the fantasy of a strict separation between lack and excess. So they identify lack with an absence of enjoyment and excess with a surfeit of it, a plenitude of it. Greek citizens, for instance, could devote themselves to the excesses of political contestation and sexual pleasure because they consigned lack to the household, where women and slaves took care of the operation. The division of the polis and the oikos was first and foremost, I think, a division of enjoyment and lack, or an attempt to make that kind of division. In the case of capitalism, the fantasy actually continues this strict separation of lack and enjoyment, although it ceased to assign lack permanently to a certain class of people in the way that ancient Greek society did. Capitalist economy depends on subjects viewing themselves as lacking while identifying a non-lacking enjoyment in the other. This is the basic capitalist fantasy. The enjoyment is what capitalist subjects aim to appropriate through the process of exchange and the production and consumption. One involves oneself in capitalist exchange in order to access the other's enjoyment for oneself. The laborer works in excess of what it takes to reproduce society as it is, and a fantasy of unsurpassable enjoyment resides in the excess that Marx calls surplus value. I think, obviously, Marx doesn't have a theory of enjoyment, but I think the notion of surplus value, and Jacques Lacan develops this in his seminar 16 From Another to the Other, his notion of surplus value is already leading to an idea of surplus enjoyment, that's what the capitalist is really after. Without the fantasy structure that identifies this excess with unlimited enjoyment, capitalism simply could not function. So if we didn't have the idea that appropriating an excess would be appropriating an excess enjoyment, and enjoyment without lack, there would be no capitalist society as we know it would not exist. It is as essential to capitalism as the market, purchasable labor power, or the general equivalent. So this fantasy is necessary because capitalism requires subjects for whom accumulation is the unbreakable law. If we already believe that we've achieved the ultimate enjoyment, we would not embark on the process of continually accumulating more. I think this, to me, is absolutely true. Capitalist subjects accumulate with the idea of amassing enough money or enough commodities to allow them to enjoy without restraint. I really like Rafael Nadal, and he's playing tennis right now in the French Open. I assume he's still playing. And I heard a sad thing that he bought this amazing, huge yacht that he has. And he goes on. And I thought, what is that except purchase of a yacht like that? What is it except the idea that I can accumulate, when I get a yacht like that, I'm going to be able to enjoy utterly without restraint. The problem is you're on the yacht for 5 minutes and then all of a sudden you're a lacking subject again. So the point is that one never reaches the goal of having enough, because this point always recedes in the distance the closer one gets to it. There's a great novel in American literature called The Great Gatsby, and this is the point that there's this green light at the end of the dock that marks Daisy's house for Gatsby, and the closer that he gets to having her, the further that light recedes away from him. So the more one has, the more one experiences one's lack, which is why I think all these billionaires want to go into space, right? Rather than filling lack, the acquired object ends up highlighting it. And it's only the object that I don't have or don't yet have that appears to embody unlimited enjoyment. Once I have it, its failings and my failings become evident and clear. When I attain what I want, it soon becomes apparent to me that enjoyment entails having a little bit more. So I obtain what I previously desired. I desire more money, a newer phone, a larger television. Accumulating inevitably leads to the desire for additional accumulation rather than the sating of desire. Within the capitalist psychic economy, no one says, I have enough, because no one ever experiences what they have as excessive enough. So this is why we often say, there's this great line in Chinatown, how much better can you eat? What can you buy that you don't already have? Jake Geddes says this to Noah Cross. And what's interesting is Noah Cross says back to him, he says, no, it's about the future, Mr. Geddes. But I think in a way, the answer to that question is, once you're in capitalist society, nothing really ever is enough. Even the most excessive fortune seems inadequate to the one who has it. The more excessive it becomes, the more inadequate it appears. I think this is because the experience of an excess cannot be as satisfying as the image that it promises, of the image of the enjoyment that it promises, which means it never really delivers us from our lack. Never even for a little bit, I don't think. This is the basic psychic problem that capitalist society, which is the first society structured around excess, it's the basic problem that it confronts. Since the capitalist fantasy is inherently unrealizable, the disappointment that it produces often leads to a reaction, that is, the reaction of reactionary politics that derives from paranoia. So the psychic disposition of capitalism is always on the verge of tipping into paranoia so it has this hidden authority, invisible authority, structural authority, and it has a fantasy structure that animates the system that constantly makes subjects feel like they've missed out on something that everyone else is privy to, has access to. So as a result, capitalist democracy constantly confronts the danger of fascism, which builds itself on the logic of paranoia. And the fact that the early 20th century dealt with the danger of Hitler, while the early 21st century encounters that of Bolsonaro, Trump, it's not just the luck of the draw, right? Capitalist democracy relies on the subject's fantasy of the other's enjoyment, and thus inevitably leads to outbreaks of paranoid fascism. To fight fascism while defending capitalism is akin to hacking off the tops of dandelions. If you do this, the act of doing so can stem the weed for a little bit of time, but you've actually simultaneously blown the seeds of the weed everywhere. So the image of the other enjoying excessively is what motivates the capitalist subject to prize accumulation above all other activities. This image motivates the subject's incessant competition. Without this fantasy of the enjoying other or the enjoyable future, no one would embark on the project of accumulation to the extent that capitalism requires it in order to function. Even Adam Smith confesses this in his book on morality. He says that capitalist society has to have a falsehood that drives the entire structure. He says the wealthy have to be here's what he says. He notes that the wealthy are actually living miserable lives, but the fantasy that their wealth brings complete satisfaction is a necessary one. So Smith argues that this fantasy, this is how he puts it, rouses and keeps in continual motion the industry of mankind. So if we don't believe in the fantasy of accumulation leading to an ultimate satisfaction, we'll cease to invest ourselves in the project of accumulation. But the image of a fully enjoying other that drives the capitalist subject to accumulate also represents a clear and present danger to the political structure of capitalist democracy. When I seek an explanation for my failure to escape black, the fantasy itself points toward a ready explanation, the other's enjoyment, that doesn't coexist with my lack, but is actually the cause of it. So when taking stock of my own inability to have the enjoyment that I see manifested in the phantasmatic image of the other, I become paranoid about the other. And in this way, the basic capitalist fantasy easily and quickly turns into paranoia about the other stealing my enjoyment. And at this moment, fascism has the ability to erupt. Fascism is, I would say, the putting into practice of paranoia. It identifies an other responsible for the theft of the society's excess and engages in the impossible project of eliminating this other in order to access this excess that the other has purportedly stolen. So fascism can try to eliminate the other in several ways: by changing the law to lessen the other's political power, by forcing this other into segregated living spaces, by throwing this other out of the country, or most drastically, by systematically murdering this other. Though there are degrees of fascism, the logic that undergirds it remains the same in each manifestation. The link between capitalist fantasy and fascist paranoia also always remains the same. The conscious project of fascism lies in eliminating the excessive other and distributing its illegitimately obtained excess, its authority, back to the proper subjects. On the one hand, paranoia constantly reminds the subject of its failures in relation to the other, who is the real authority hidden behind the public view, the real figure of enjoyment. This other illegitimately enjoys an excess that properly belongs to the subject, while the subject toils away in its own lack. So for the paranoiac, immigrants come to this country, for instance, illegally, take jobs and benefits that properly belong to citizens. Chinese leaders appropriate the capital that rightly belongs to America. Champions of political correctness take away all of our formerly permitted social transgressions. In all these ways, paranoia actually ensconces its adherents in disappointment. But on the other hand, paranoia is such a satisfying psychic position because it allows us to believe that there's someone who really enjoys without lack. While attacking the other who has stolen our excess, we actually enjoy this excess in a way that would be impossible. So the paranoiac enjoys through the thief of its excess. In this sense, paranoid subjectivity allows us to glimpse an excessiveness that no one can ever experience. And because it provides this access to a pure excess that doesn't really exist, paranoia has an appeal, I think, that outstrips all other psychic structures. And this is why subjects are so ready to adopt a paranoid attitude, even when it directly contradicts not only the facts, but also their own moral compass. Fascist paranoia is difficult to undo because whenever it reveals that the other lacks just like the paranoid subject, the subject can always imagine a hidden excess lurking within that lack. This is why news reports that depict the horrible plight of refugees or the normality of immigrants are seldom effective. The excess that the paranoid subject sees has nothing to do with the empirical other. This excess is the subject's own self-relation that it incorrectly attributes to the other. To abandon one's belief in the other's excessiveness is to abandon one's own ability to enjoy it. This is why it's so hard to get a paranoid subject to give up this belief. Even as the paranoid subject inveighs against the other's excesses, the subject enjoys through them. It gets an impossible, or glimpses an impossible enjoyment through what it inveighs against. But in the end, fascism's a failed project, not just because it's horrible, it perpetuates violence against the purportedly excessive other, but because it has an internal contradiction. Fascism cannot succeed. It ends up just bringing total destruction because its paranoid structure depends upon the other that it tries to eliminate. If it did successfully eliminate the other, fascism would leave its subjects bereft of the excess that this other enjoys because it exists only insofar as the other does. Its self-defeat is written into its structure, which doesn't make it less ruthless, it actually makes it more ruthless. One escapes the logic of paranoia and its concomitant fascism only insofar as one accepts that one's enjoyment is inextricable from one's lack. Excess doesn't fill in lack and eliminate it, but always recreates it anew, which is why the more that we shop, the more that we want to shop, or the more that we search on the internet, the more that we want to search on the internet. Excess is always the path to the confrontation with our lack because it's our lack itself that is excessive. When we see that our lack is the source of our excess, we no longer need the other to serve for us as the site of enjoyment. We can begin to take responsibility for our own enjoyment and to break from this paranoid turn. And this is the wager of psychoanalysis. It's what separates psychoanalysis from the capitalist fantasy. This wager is that we can accede to the fundamental link between lack and enjoyment, between lack and excess. While psychoanalytic theory doesn't provide a ready-made guide to political struggle in the capitalist universe, it does have the virtue, I think, of revealing what an alternative to capitalism must take into account. We can genuinely break from the logic of capitalism only insofar as we accept this indissociable link between lack and enjoyment. Even with the greatest shared abundance, we'll necessarily suffer from a shared scarcity because it is through what we don't have that we enjoy ourselves. Fascist subjects find themselves bereft of the enjoyment that they see rampant within capitalist society. Everyone else seems to be getting off, but the subject itself. The subject experiences itself as cut off from this enjoyment of the other. Everyone fantasizes about the enjoyment of the other, but one slips into paranoia at the moment some agent becomes responsible for depriving the subject of this enjoyment. Fascism emerges out of the paranoia that first produces the right-wing populace. Right-wing populism is organized around enjoyment. Populist leaders supply people with the agent responsible for their failure to enjoy as much as others do. But they do more than this. They enable followers to enjoy through their hatred of the figure responsible for their failure to enjoy. And this is the fascist move, I think. By following the populist or fascist leader, we see behind the curtain and recognize who's really running the capitalist show and thereby cheating us out of our enjoyment. The paranoia relieves us of the burden of our freedom by both giving us someone to follow, the fascist leader, and providing a figure who's really in charge, the target of our paranoid suspicions. The only path out of the inherent paranoia of capitalist subjectivity is through this embrace of the enjoyment of lack. And the starting place for this enjoyment must be the recognition that there is no modern authority, that we have the ability to be our own authorities without relying on anything else to be responsible for our enjoying. The authority in capitalist society is always a fraud, whatever that authority appears to be. And this gives us the opportunity to assert our responsibility against this fraudulence. The vulnerability of capitalism stems from its absence of a visible authority, even though this is also the source of its strength. Modern subjectivity takes its point of departure in a challenge to the invisible authority that it confronts in the capitalist universe. And I think that a nice joke that embodies this source of authority is the following. So Bill Clinton and Pope Francis die on the same day in the future. And Clinton gets to heaven a little bit before Pope Francis. I don't know, God let him in quickly. And he comes to greet Pope Francis at the gates. When he comes in, Pope Francis comes in, Clinton greets him. Clinton says, "What's the first thing you want to do when you get here?" And Pope Francis goes, "I want to go see the Virgin Mary." And Clinton says, "Sorry, you're 15 minutes too late." So to me, this is one of the great, a nice little example of the way in which even the sight of perfect, non-lacking, a figure of non-lack, the Virgin Mary, is herself corrupted by Bill Clinton. Okay, that's it.